Hi, I'm Sebastian James, and I'm an expert on tax policy and tax administration. I've been working in this area for over 15 years, and today I'll be talking to you about how to make tax policy work for attracting foreign direct investment and investment in particular. In general, it is undisputed that tax does have impact foreign direct investment. That is, if you have a higher tax rates, generally tend to have lesser investment. That is just by the very fact that for a business investor, for an investor, higher tax rates means lower returns, and therefore lower tax rates encourages more investment. And this is what we see throughout the world, and it's an undisputed fact. The issue is about how much tax, how should we use tax policy to be able to attract investment, to be able to attract the right kind of investment, the investment that the government would like to use, and what are the consequences of those actions? Because every action has its unintended policy consequences, and that's what we want to be able to understand. Second, while we know that FDI in general does have is affected by tax rates, and lower tax rates generally increase FDI, there is a subtext to the whole to this, because some kinds of FDI are influenced a lot by tax policy, while others are not. At the same time, in some circumstances in certain countries, tax policy does have a big impact on FDI, while in others it does not. And if you talk about what are the instruments that are used by governments to attract, what are the tax policy instruments that governments use to attract investment in FDI? Most common are tax holidays, in which you just allow companies not to pay taxes for a certain period of time. You could have investment-linked incentives, like accelerated depreciation, investment tax credits, investment allowances, specific tax exemptions for export. In some cases, government may designate certain areas of the country as tax-free zones. So if an investor sets up in those zones, they don't pay any taxes. It could be direct taxes, it could be indirect taxes. Now, what do we see? What is the impact of tax changes on FDI? So we did this study in Central and West Africa, and we looked at these countries which shared a common currency. And what we did is we tracked tax policy changes and how FDI was influenced or not influenced by these things. We came up with a very remarkable finding. We found that in these 12 countries, there's almost no effect of tax policy on investment, and this was quite surprising, because it goes against the general trend that if tax does influence investment. And this was one of the first studies where we looked at tax policy affecting FDI in the context of a developing country, because a lot of research has taken place in developed countries, and the general consensus is that yes, lower tax rates does influence tax policy, FDI in a positive way. But in the developing countries, due to lack of data, we find that we are unable to get what the actual effects are. And so this study kind of showed that at least in the Central and West African countries, when you increase the tax holidays, there's almost no effect on investment. However, when in certain cases, when tax holidays are specifically granted to export-oriented investments, we did find some effect on investment. But what's most amazing we found was the non-tax factors had a much bigger influence, especially when the complexity of the tax incentives was reduced, when legal guarantees were increased for investors. We found that investments responded positively. Now, while we did find, we found no effect in the Central and West Africa, we did a similar study in the Eastern Caribbean states, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And we looked at all these countries, and we looked at tourism investment specifically, because that's the kind of investment that these countries attract a lot. And we looked at the case where Antigua versus the other countries. And Antigua had, in the year 2004, introduced a tax break and greatly expanded the tax incentive for tourism operators. And we found that in these countries, when Antigua gave this disproportionately high tax incentive, in FDI responded fantastically. So it kind of goes against what we saw in Central and West Africa. While there we found no effect of FDI on FDI on tax rates, we did find big effect of FDI in the Caribbean. Now, how do we put these two things together? So we then took all the countries and then did the same analysis we did before. Like let's just chart FDI and the effective tax rate. And as in the beginning, it's undisputed that this is a sloping down line. I mean, when you increase tax rates, you have lower FDI. That is an undisputed fact. But what we did now is we took a list of countries, we ranked them according to the doing business indicators of investment climate. We took the top half and the bottom half of these countries and graphed the same differently. So we took this different groups of countries and we just plotted them on different axes, on the same axis but in different charts. What we found was, while in the top group of countries, the countries with a good investment climate, increasing taxes had reduced FDI considerably. So there was a high response of taxes of taxes on FDI. We found this response was very muted in the case of the bottom group of countries. So the bottom group of countries, when the investment climate is poor, raising or lowering taxes had almost no impact on FDI, while in the countries which had good investment climate, raising and lowering taxes had a big impact on FDI. And this might explain why in the Central and West African countries we did find no response, while in the Caribbean countries we did find a good response, because those were the countries where, because the investment climate was conducive for investment, changing tax rates did have an effect, while in the case of in the Central and West Africa, because the investment climate was not conducive, just giving a tax break could not make up for those factors that were fundamentally a problem. For example, infrastructure, for lack of available skills, labor skills, easy import and export of those of goods. Because these fundamental factors were not conducive, raising or lowering taxes had no effect. So you need to, basically the takeaway was, unless you address the fundamental investment climate factors, tax policy will have no effect. And this is so when we look, so this is a group of countries, but it's also on the kind of investment. When we look at mining FDI, for example, we find almost no effect of tax policy on mining FDI. Raising or lowering the tax rates for a mining resource will attract or detract investments in the same manner. So, and it makes sense because if you're looking for a mine, the mine is located in a country, the resource is in that country. So that resource is less, you want to access the resource. So raising or lowering the taxes has very little impact on your decision to go and invest. If you want to invest, if you want to extract bauxite, you go to where the bauxite is. If you want to extract gold, you go to where the gold is. So tax factors matter less in those cases. So at least at this point, we can draw two conclusions. One is that investment climate factors are critical. Second, that it's also important the kind of FDI and how tax policy affects depends on the kind of FDI. Certain kinds of FDI affects, tax policy does affect, and certain kind it does not. Now, we also ask investors themselves, because this is econometric analysis looking at data, but I think the best way to understand what affects FDI and investment is to ask investors themselves, what do you think are the important factors for you to invest in a certain country? And what we found was, we were really surprised by some of the results we found in developing countries. When we asked investors, would you have invested if you did not get incentives? A large percentage, a majority of them said yes, they would have invested even if they didn't get the tax breaks. So it is almost as if the tax breaks were given up for free. And it's the kind of perception difference that you see there, where for the investors, the tax factors may not be the critical factor, but for the government, they feel that giving the tax break is the one which makes the difference. So So it's in a sense it kind of it kind of shedding light on the fact if tax factors are not the critical factors in attracting FDI, then so maybe it's by actually addressing this issue where it is effective and what conditions is effective will actually help governments to be able to then design better policies on how to do these, how to use tax policy in a more subtle and a more targeted manner. What we find in the same discussion with exporters is, with investors, is investors who are exporting tend to be more sensitive to incentives than investors who are not exporting. Investors who tend to are attracted towards the domestic market, they tend to be less influenced by incentives than those who are primarily aimed at exporting. And that makes sense because because you want to have a lower price in your market, and therefore what is critical is where you want to be locate so that you can actually make sure you get the lowest price and compete with your investors. And it goes back into how investors think through the process of investing. Say a large multinational corporation has to decide they want to invest in a certain country, in a certain sector. Then they essentially do what we call a long list and a short list. So they decide first in a long list, what are these countries that are potential locations for my investment? And when drawing that long list, and then they kind of eliminate possible locations, and then they come to a short list. In the short list of countries or investment destinations, they then go into much greater detail as to what location would be most conducive so that we can get a better deal, get get our investment off the ground quickly, be able to be able to do a better job at at a good product at a low price. So because investors go through this two-stage process, it kind of this explains what we see when we look at the data that we talked about, where we talked about investment climate being important, certain kinds of FDI being important. So if the first step is in the long list, you see that investment climate factors come in, because if a country has very poor political stability, its investment climate is not considered to be good, its regulatory environment is very complicated, it won't even find itself in the long list. So to get into the long list, you should be among those countries that are known to be attractive for investment. So which is why political stability matters, geography matters. If you're close to your market, if the intended market, that it helps. This actually puts, for example, Central America as a big advantage when it comes to the US market. It puts Southeast Asia very attractive in terms of the Chinese market. So, and then when you look at the long list, you'll find many countries don't even make it to the long list because they're not able to address the fundamental fears of an investor to where to locate. But once you come from the long list to the short list, that's where the other factors matter, because now you have a list of countries which are essentially on the same, quite similarly attractive for your location. Now you go into the more finer factors. So the tax factors comes in, more location-specific cost factors come in. And that's where you see that when countries with good business environment, the tax factors matter, because now these are the countries in the short list. These are countries with good investment climate. In the short list, taxes do matter. And it kind of goes with the way investors think through the process of this investment. So in a way, what you would say is that for a country to be able to do well, to be able to attract investment, it is not important to give incentives. Incentives will not change the fundamental factor of cost factors in your investment. If if your country is basically uncompetitive on cost factors, then it's throwing tax incentives does not address those problems, those issues. And second thing is that it's also important to understand what is the kind of investment you're trying to attract. And we go into like the major typology. If it's a market-seeking investment, if the investment is primarily trying to it's primarily attracted to your market. So large markets, Brazil, China, or even in a small country, but it's a telecom market, it's a mobile phone market or telecom market. It's primarily aimed, the target is your country. And there, in those kind of investments, tax incentives are not so important. Tax matters less because it's the market that's important. They want to come to your country because they're looking at the market. Giving a tax break or not giving a tax break has less of an influence. And resource-seeking investment, as we had seen before, the resources in your country, they will come unless you have a expropriated tax rate. If your tax rates are reasonable, taxes don't matter in those cases. On the other hand, when you talk about efficiency-seeking investment, where investments are primarily targeting low costs, tax is an important cost for them, and therefore tax incentives do matter. And a classic example would be textile investments. These are mobile investments. They can set up quickly. They can close down quickly. These investments move around the world seeking the lowest cost because everybody wants a low price for the shirts or the garments that they are exporting. And therefore, in these kind of investments, tax do matter. And finally, specifically investments that are driven by taxes. For example, where your headquarters is set up. So, for example, you'll see pharmaceutical companies set up in Ireland or Netherlands with the primary goal of reducing costs of the tax cost. And that would be primarily tax-driven investments. So, in conclusion, I would say there are when a government tries to design a tax policy for attracting foreign direct investment, there are positives and there are negatives. It's fundamentally, if you have a poor investment climate, taxes don't matter. It only improves your chances if you're already in a good position. So if you look at in terms of sequencing, first address investment climate issues, then go to the tax issues, then try to use tax policy as an instrument. Now, if let's say governments do decide, yes, we do want to give some tax breaks, it should be aware that there are negative consequences. And this is something that should be kept in mind when you design a tax policy. When you decide you want to go down the path, yes, I want to use tax policy as an instrument to attract investment. The first is that these have costs, revenue costs, because you're not collecting taxes from a certain group of investors. So first is this cost has to be borne by somebody else. So if you don't collect taxes from one group, you have to collect higher taxes from the others. And what you may want to encourage, you may end up discouraging another group because higher taxes for others would create its own investment impact. And therefore, this is the balancing act that governments need to do. If they play winners and losers, then there are losers in the system who may, and the negative effects on the higher tax rates on the other investors may be more than the positive effects that you want to encourage from this group of investors. And the other factor is that you must be aware that countries are also competing for the same kind of FDI, for the same pool of FDI. And so that creates a race to the bottom. You may have countries giving more and more attractive tax breaks so that they want to outcompete their neighbor. And this is a classic, what we call a prisoner's dilemma problem. And it's something that cannot be addressed on its own. It's only when countries get together and agree on some common set of rules that you can address this problem. And it's a big problem. It's a problem that we need to address fundamentally. And the third part is, remember, once you give a tax break, you're going to create distortions in the economy. You're going to encourage a certain kind of investment. You're going to discourage a certain kind of investment. And the question for you is it the right investment for you to encourage? Is that the winning investment that you want to encourage? Because you should end up backing an investment that turns out to be not the right one for you, because you are investing tax dollars to be able to attract those investments. So in conclusion, I would say governments should be aware that there are FDI there's a range of FDI. How you use tax policy does matter, but it affects FDI in different ways, in different kinds of FDI. It also does it also interact with the investment climate, and so addressing investment climate factors are far more important than before you then go on to the tax factors. And even when you use tax policy to attract investment, you must be aware of the unintended consequences of these things. So there would be higher tax evasion, there would be higher administrative costs, there would be higher costs for some group of investors than the others. So governments need to be aware of these factors when they design the tax policy to attract FDI. And in that sense, they would be able to get the best out of it. Because fundamentally, the government is trying to address a market failure. You would expect the economy to attract a certain kind of investment, a high-skill investment that create jobs. It's not happening. So the question is, the government comes in and intervenes through the tax system to be able to address that problem. The question is whether that is the right approach. And so when you use tax policy, it's not the only policy you need to use. It should be more as a part of a broader a strategy to address that market failure. So understand why is that investments are not happening, why is it that your country is not attracting a certain high value, high skill investment. And so if we could address those fundamental factors under a broader policy, with tax policy as being one of the instruments you use, I think you will have governments have a better chance at addressing those issues. That's all. Thank you.